Let's talk about the anxious eater. In all the courses that I teach, I always take a few minutes just to explain my stacking model. We're going to talk about how feeding disorders develop. And what I want you to do is think about 3 blocks stacked on top of each other. The first block is physiology. That's how your body functions. That's not anatomy. Physiology is how your body functions. And that is always going to include both body and brain functioning, cognition, emotions, and sensory processing. The second stack are motor skills. That's gross and fine motor skills. So keep in mind that oral motor skills are a fine motor skill. The third stack, the roof on the building, are those learned behaviors that kids do because something went awry with one of the stacks down below. So consider perhaps that the child was born with a cleft palate. That would influence fine motor skills or the ability to chew and swallow safely. Let's say that the child was challenged by gastroesophageal reflux disease. That would be part of physiology. However, even if he was provided with some medication, he may have already developed some learned behaviors that make him very hesitant to try new foods. Feeding disorders can develop just out of one instance that causes a lot of anxiety as well. Again, that's part of physiology. I certainly have had children on my caseload who have developed a feeding disorder because they choked on a piece of candy and now they're scared to eat almost anything. Let's talk about the vicious cycle. A child's relationship with food always influences the family's relationships with food. That in turn makes a shift in family behavior, and that will begin to affect family dynamics. Family dynamics then begin to trickle down and impact family behavior, which then changes the family's relationship with food, and in turn begins to influence the child's relationship with food. Let's talk about the spectrum of eating and anxiety and how that can play a role. When we think about typical picky eating, we want to keep in mind that there are a variety of reasons that that can morph into a feeding disorder. But we may also have children that we're working with who also have an anxiety disorder. We know that at least 25% of typically developing kids will develop a feeding disorder. Not all kids with feeding disorders have anxiety disorders, but sometimes a child will present with both. Some picky eaters will have anxiety disorders, but I've never met a kid with any sort of feeding challenge, whether it be picky eating or a feeding disorder, who wasn't anxious about new foods. So what is anxiety? Anxiety can be adaptive or disordered. So typical anxiety that many of us encounter is considered adaptive. It keeps us safe. It's a response to real danger. It prevents us from repeating mistakes. But when it becomes a disorder, it results in functional impairment. It's equivalent to a false alarm. It leads to unnecessary avoidance. What does anxiety and avoidance look like? Well, you might be surprised. Here are just a few signs. The kids can look distracted. They can be hyper-talkative. How about avoidance that's disguised as disinterest? Sometimes we'll see kids with angry outbursts not seemingly related to the event. We also will notice a need for control and/or rigid behaviors to control their environment. Or the more obvious signs include crying and apparent inability to self-soothe, shaking, expressions of fear, and adamant refusal to participate in activities. I want you to consider that there are many different reasons to pursue extra help, and This is just a brief rundown, but in general, if a child's reaction to trying a new food appears to be out of proportion to the situation, including but not limited to consistent gagging, consistent strong verbal or behavioral resistance, consistent avoidance, consistent disinterest in new foods, consistent resistance to interacting with a new food and that sensory experience of sight, sound, taste, touch, or smell. If the situation is bringing stress to the child, the family, or the classroom, that is reason to discuss it with the child's pediatrician. Not all young kids grow out of picky eating. It's never a good idea to just wait for them to grow out of it. Be proactive and know that pediatricians can refer children for a feeding evaluation conducted by a certified speech-language pathologist or an occupational therapist.